Hello, I'm Toby Rutter, and this is the interview analysis for the research and development of my Year 1 FMP, Cats and Music. I chose to interview my mother, and throughout the analysis I will refer to her as the subject or the interview subject or interviewee. And I'm really pleased with who I chose to interview. She gave very sort of in-depth answers. There were no closed answers, no yes or no. There was none of that. I was really pleased that I chose her, as she did give some really good answers. I chose to explore three key themes from the play because I didn't want to just sort of pick out individual lines from the play and give a question because of one line. I thought what would be better, both for myself as a performer exploring the play and for receiving open answers, would be to pick out three key themes that I have interpreted from the play. And the themes that I picked out were authority, community, and class. And something that stood out to me from the authority sort of area of the interview was when I asked the question, did the authoritarian figures in your formative years tend to encourage your discipline? And that was the second question that I asked. And my expectation was that the answer would be teachers disciplined, parents encouraged. But what the answer actually ended up being was that parents disciplined, teachers encouraged. And that got me thinking, and I did a little bit of research and I did some of my own thinking into that answer. And I think as we have gone through this sort of state education system and we've grown as individuals, even in young people, I think young people now believe that they can rebel against their educational figures. And so I think these teachers and educational figures, I think they rely on parents and people, figuratively and literally closer to home. I think they rely on these figures to discipline the children that they teach. Because, I speak from research and personal experience. I think teachers now feel that if they were to try and discipline a child, that child would fight back. Whereas historically, children conform to their teachers' wishes. I think now that children have, almost realised that they have free will and they can fight back, I think teachers now do rely on figures, as I said, figuratively and literally closer to home, to discipline the children. And so there is almost that technique now with teachers that if they encourage, the children will respond better. And then we come on to what was mentioned from the subject of that mutual respect. She went into that a little bit, where if she respected the teachers, they respected her. There was a good relationship there, and she responded better to that. And I think we see that now in our day-to-day lives as well, that if there is mutual respect, people tend to respond a lot better. So moving on to the community part of the interview, one of my questions was, can you remember any outcasts within communities that you've lived in or neighbourhoods? And the subject said yes, and that there was somebody who lived within the village that the subject lived in. And one of the things that popped up to me in my head was one of the reasons that the subject gave for them, this family being outcasts, and that was that they drank rather a lot. And the fact that they drank rather a lot made them outcasts. Now, I'll use this word again, historically, people, especially in the United Kingdom, do tend to drink a lot. But I think that when alcoholism reaches an antisocial state, that's when it's frowned upon. And that's what it seemed to be with the family mentioned in the interview. But I also looked back at it, the question in particular about outcasts and the fact that drinking made them outcasts. And I look back at the play and I think that, well, the entirety of the cat massacre that occurred within Cats and Music was planned over a drink. You know, it's scene 19 with the locals in the I think it's the Griffin, and then they move to the function room of the Griffin. The cat massacre is planned during, you know, these locals being drunk, and so, and also going back to one of the first scenes within the play in Act 1, or Act 3, as it is all very complicated. Act 3, but chronologically Act 1. The sort of social higher-ups within the play tell the characters Jean and Stuart, don't drink in the Griffin. And I suppose the people who drink in the Griffin may be seen as the outcasts and to be frowned upon. And the whole planning of the cat massacre takes place over drunkenness in the function room of the Griffin. So, you know, that was one of the things that popped up to me with this outcasts question, is drunkenness and the sort of antisocial behaviour that comes with that. And that those things instantly connected in my head is that the cat massacre was planned with alcohol. Moving on to the final theme that I investigated, which was class. One of my lines as Keith is, I am a firm believer in social mobility. And so I wanted to look a little bit into social mobility and whether people, you know, every day believe in that. And so my question was, what does social mobility mean to you, and do you believe in it? And the answer was yes. But I think from, again, personal research and personal experience and thoughts and views, social mobility is not something that happens every day. And I think in my character, Keith's head, social mobility is something that just happens. If you work hard enough, it just happens. But social mobility is not a common occurrence. Even if you do put the work in and you work really hard, I don't think it comes down to hard work. The subject said that they do believe in social mobility and that if you put the work in, you know, it all works out. But I think social mobility is one of those things that has been so overly promoted by the media and by famous people such as Gordon Ramsay. You know, he grew up in a council estate and is now a world-renowned chef. Or, you know, certain actors that grew up in a very poor family and are now superstars. I think that social mobility has been promoted to a point that everyone thinks they should believe in it. And like I said, from personal research, personal views and opinion, I don't think social mobility is something that just happens. I think that it all comes down to a big break, and that as I said, it's not something that happens every day. If you look at all the actors that have had their big break and do promote social mobility, if you then look at all the sort of hundreds, maybe thousands of actors, maybe tens of thousands of actors and models and musicians and this sort of thing that haven't had their big break, and maybe they grew up in a council estate but they're not where they want to be. Social mobility is something very rare, and I will be taking that into my character as a total contrast. I think that most people in the audience will be thinking social mobility is very possible, and I want to play into that as an actor and go, I'm a firm believer in social mobility. That's something I believe in. You believe in it too. We all believe in it. It's very possible. And I really want to tap into that and engage with them and their views. But as we sort of go towards the end of my monologue as Keith, that's why I'm standing in front of you. Because maybe it's quite probable that a lot of the audience members, they have tried to elevate themselves, so to speak, and haven't succeeded. So really tapping into that and going, that's why I'm standing in front of you, which is another one of my lines, and sort of engaging with them that way. One final thing that I found interesting was the individuality in the subject's answers. My final question was, to what extent do you think that the class a person is born into limits them through their life? And the subject focused on extracurricular opportunities, so opportunities offered by school but not everyone being able to take those opportunities. And furthermore, the choice of group that they associate themselves with. And I thought it was really interesting that the subject thought that it all boiled down to what the schools offered. And furthermore, that they thought the individuality of associations mattered that much. So yeah, I think especially looking at I think it's scene 10, scene 11 maybe, with the boys, the characters, the boys, and how boy one, straight away chooses violence and all this sort of thing. Boy one is mentioned, and Owen, it's also mentioned, grows up on the Burnside Hill estate, which is a council estate. And they are portrayed in the play as violent characters, and it, rather than resolving these things with communication, and it becomes a fight. And I think that's a really interesting thing we can look into, that the writer has chosen, rather than portraying these characters' problems being resolved as a conversation, the writer has chosen to portray it as a fight. And, it all boils down to these friendships, and as the subject mentioned in my interview, who you choose to associate yourselves with. And I think, we're all guilty of looking at certain groups and thinking, and, looking at certain people and thinking, why would you choose to associate yourself with the people you have? But I think, it's even more interesting that the writer of Cats and Music, Tom Fowler, has chosen to portray the resolution of these issues as a fight rather than a conversation, from these people from a council estate. So yes, as I said, I'm really pleased with the answers that the subject gave. I'm really pleased with how the interview went. Going forward, I think, as much as I've taken feedback from my previous interview and have transformed my interview style to be more of a conversation, I think I can take that further in my next interview. Thank you very much.